The current Food Aid Convention was negotiated as a treaty 43 years ago, and it's not significantly been modified since then. Consequently, it simply doesn't any longer relate to current realities. It commits the signatories to providing food aid in terms of wheat equivalent, and wheat is no longer the major way in which food aid is provided. The major way in which food aid is provided is governments basically provide cash for the food to be acquired locally in the countries themselves or in the neighbouring region. Secondly, because it was negotiated as part of the Kennedy round, and who remembers the Kennedy round of trade negotiations, it was basically the US and the European economic communities, it then was, agreeing that both of them would provide certain amounts of food aid as a way of disposing of their surplus food. What it's done over time, it's gradually evolved into something different, which is the idea of ensuring that there should be a minimum amount of food aid, whatever the current circumstances, which can be there to meet humanitarian crises as these arise, because they can't really be predicted in advance. But again, unfortunately, what we've got are these wheat equivalent commitments by the US, the European community as a whole, and a few other countries, which brings us really to the next problem. I mean, who are the signatories to the convention? It's basically the US, the European Union, Australia, Canada, Norway, Switzerland, Japan, and Argentina, though Argentina has never ever actually contributed anything under the committee. So that's the reality. Now, again, we have to say, presently, a substantial part of the food aid which is being provided in the world is not being provided by these countries. You've got countries like India, China, Saudi Arabia chipping in as it suits them. Some years they don't. So we have a very unclear situation, a very uncertain situation, and the convention as it is simply doesn't address these realities. Another problem with the convention, because it was negotiated as part of a trade agreement, or in conjunction with the trade agreement, it basically relates to the World Trade Organization based agriculture agreement. But this is supposed to be about food aid, most of which is provided for people in crisis, in humanitarian crises. But this standalone agreement really is unrelated to any of the rest of the what we would call global architecture for providing humanitarian, providing food security. It's just a standalone treaty. Well, I think the first thing is we have to have a clear statement of what the objective of the convention is supposed to be now and for the foreseeable future. It's got multiple objectives at the moment, and the question is, what really is its primary function? Is it to ensure that there's sufficient humanitarian food assistance available, taking into account of volatility in world commodity prices, taking into account volatility in currencies, and also the way economic crises are impacting on governments' aid budgets. I think that's the first thing. The second thing, what ought the commitments to be in the future? And clearly 5.4 million tonnes of wheat equivalent is no objective which is going to really carry much influence with those who have to justify their aid budgets. It's not going to carry very much conviction in partner countries. So I think the commitments have to be re-examined. There are various possibilities. One of these could be, for example, to recognise that what they're trying to do is to ensure that there's really enough resources to enable people in crises to feed themselves. So you could say, for example, they could collectively guarantee, let's say, to provide enough resources to enable, say, 20 million people a year to feed themselves. Another could be a statement in terms of recognising people's right to food, and what they're attempting to do is collectively agree to try and support people's right to foods in crises. The difficulty of that, of course, it's a kind of qualitative commitment, and who is to say whether they're succeeding or not. I think the third thing is they really have to have a broader grouping than those who signed the original treaty in 1967 and their successors. I think you've got to find a way of bringing in, let's say, members of the G20 group who are not part of the OECD, India, China, South Africa, Brazil, Russia. Would be that would be something I think we should attempt. The next thing I think is it working? Well, we don't know whether it's working because there's no proper monitoring system in place. And I think what we've got to do is to think in terms of some form of transparent peer review of the members of the convention as to whether they've collectively succeeded in doing what they've agreed to, and also I think looking at what each other's contributed. I think the EU and the US working together is important. I mean, if we look, for example, at the negotiations on the agreement on agriculture and food aid within those negotiations between, let's say, 2002 and when the negotiations on the WTO agreement broke down, it very much depended on those two parties and their disagreements. That was really the difficult part of the process. So I think if they could find more common ground working together on these things, that would really be very important. And so this meeting, for example, insofar as it contributes to that and offers an opportunity to learn more about each other and exchange views in an informal way, I think that could be a useful role for the meeting.